On the Newsmaker hotline is Ed Meese, former Attorney General. We asked him to come on today because we thought it would be nice to talk to him about the life and legacy of Margaret Thatcher. Given the fact that Ed Meese was the Attorney General back during the Reagan years, and there was this special bond between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. General Meese, how are you today?
Fine, thank you. Good to be with you.
You got to see it up close and personal. How strong was the relationship between Margaret Thatcher and President Reagan?
Well, there was no question that it was a very close friendship, as well as kind of two minds that worked together, had the same beliefs, particularly in free market economics and in limited government, those kinds of things, but also people who worked together extremely well in pursuit of their common objectives, one of which, of course, was ending the Cold War with the West, for the forces of freedom on the right side and the winning side.
Attorney General Meese, you gave a speech at Hillsdale about 10 years ago called Morality and Foreign Policy, Reagan and Thatcher, and you focused mostly on that, about their common desire to defeat the Soviet Union. And I think retrospectively people think, the history has sort of been rewritten about this, and they said, it was really Gorbachev that did it, and the economic system was bound to fail. But at the time, when the two of them took power there in the late 70s, early 80s, it was an impossible dream to think that the Soviet Union would be demolished within 10 years.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, the pundits in this country, as well as in Europe and in England, all were saying that capitalism had peaked and was on the downhill path, that we would have to have totalitarianism and freedom living side by side perpetually into the future.
Which brings us to today, where socialism seems to be having a bit of a resurgence.
Well, it does to some extent, but I think if you look at what's happening, I believe that what we're seeing in the United States is a temporary situation. I certainly hope so. And the same is true in England. I think that we'll never get back to the point where it was when Margaret Thatcher took over. I think that the idea of free markets have indicated that that's the only way in which you can have economic growth. And our example in the United States right now of the lack of economic growth is, again, bearing out the accuracy and the truth of what Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were really talking about in the 1980s.
But what they were talking about was free enterprise, free markets, small government is better. There's not anybody out there making those arguments the same way that those two could.
Well, I think that's true, and that's one of our problems in the country right now. We don't have a strong voice for the positions of the founders. When you really think about it, both Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were talking about truths that were as common in the time of George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson as they should be today.
And could you please tell me, because you were part of the Reagan administration and certainly a friend of the former president, what kind of influence on a personal level did Margaret Thatcher have on Ronald Reagan in terms of advising and emboldening him to continue with the fights, not only here for the free market values here in the United States, but also in that fight against the Cold War?
Well, I think that they reinforced each other. And I think that when Margaret Thatcher brought England around as she did in the late 70s and early 80s, that reinforced Ronald Reagan's beliefs that he was right about the basic values of our country. So I think there was a reinforcement. I think it was a comradeship, and I think it was a strong friendship between the two so that they could work together.
Thatcher had a feeling about Gorbachev that she passed on to President Reagan. A lot of people don't believe that President Reagan would have been perhaps as open to some of the things that Gorbachev made possible had it not been for Thatcher opening the door on that.
Well, what happened was she met with Gorbachev first after he took office in 1985. And so after her meeting with him, she phoned Ronald Reagan and said, I think this is a man we can do business with. And it was not so much that he was anything less than an absolute communist. It was the fact that he understood the West. And because of that, I think he, later on, when things really got bad in the Soviet Union, realized that they could not prevail, and that's why he did not take them into a position of ruin. So I think her assessment of him early on was not only correct, but also I think it was helpful to Ronald Reagan in how he would deal with Gorbachev.
Former Attorney General Edwin Meese is our guest, and he's giving his very unique perspective on the life and legacy of Margaret Thatcher, considering he was there with the Reagan White House during the Thatcher years and the Reagan years. And, it's fascinating to me that we've had this discussion. We've been talking about it all morning. We talked about it yesterday when the news hit, and we very rarely mentioned the fact that she was the first woman prime minister. That was, of course, the big news when she was first elected, but she immediately sort of transcended the gender aspect of her prime ministership and just became a strong leader regardless of her sex.
Well, that's right. As a matter of fact, the humorous way of stating it, both in England and here, was that she was the best man in England.
Right, exactly. But what does that mean? I mean, here we are, bringing it back to domestic politics here in the U.S. Everybody's talking about how it's time for a woman president, and it seems like the big rationale for Hillary Clinton, really being coronated versus elected is that it's time for a woman, and she's the most qualified woman, so let's just have a woman. That's a stark contrast versus how Prime Minister Thatcher went about it.
That's right. She never played up the woman thing at all, or even that she was the first woman. And I guess you could use that old quote in which you could say, I know Margaret Thatcher, and Hillary Clinton is no Margaret Thatcher.
All right, Edwin Meese.
As we look at what happens, and looking at another story of what's happening on Capitol Hill with regard to gun legislation, do you have any thoughts about where we're headed, or whether or not this whole thing is troubling to you in some level?
Well, I think the problem that I have is that the president has made this a political football. What we really want to do is protect people, whether they're in school or any place where they might be victims of this kind of crime. And to make this such a political issue really does damage, I think, to the total effort. We want to have common sense efforts to keep guns out of the hands of people, criminals, people who have mental problems, and so on. And this is not helping this at all. I think it's cheapening the whole issue in the minds of the American people.
Most people would not have a problem with keeping the guns out of the hands of criminals. But none of the legislation that I see being considered on Capitol Hill seems to actually do that.
You're absolutely right. And as a matter of fact, they're ignoring the one gap in the legislation, and that is how you do deal with mentally ill people to keep guns out of their hands.
Ed Meese, since we're on the gun subject now, I think you can really illuminate something. Again, former President Ronald Reagan's words are being used to promote a so-called assault weapons ban. They're saying even Ronald Reagan was in favor of this. Why shouldn't conservatives today be? Can you shed a little light on that since you were there?
Well, I don't think that's an accurate statement at all. What he was interested in, of course, was making sure that automatic weapons, which the type of rifles that are trying to be banned now are not, were kept out of the hands, and that's been part of our law since the 1930s. But I think that in many cases, Ronald Reagan's words are being misused and distorted to say something that he never said. Ronald Reagan was very clear about the right to keep arms as the Constitution provides, and I think this is a distortion of his views.
Edwin Meese, former Attorney General under Ronald Reagan, thank you for that. And I've been wanting to have somebody who, in authority, answer that question. It's good to hear it from you.
You just heard the man who is in authority on that issue
from the source.
That's right. Ed Meese, thank you very much. Good to have you.